I'm an associate professor of geography at Old Dominion University, and I'm also the co-coordinator of the Virginia Geographic Alliance, which is a nonprofit entity associated with National Geographic that is really geared towards promoting geographic literacy, which is, I was talking with some people earlier about, this is Geography Awareness Week. So it's somewhat apropos to give this presentation this week in the present environment. I was told I had half an hour, so I will not belabor the point. Special thanks to Emma and others and the Williamsburg Regional Library. I really enjoy giving these talks. Obviously, I'd prefer the in-person environment. I often think I'm a dynamic and things, but we'll make it work via the interweb. So the left image is a picture from near where I did my advanced studies. This is a field of corn in Dublin, Ohio, in the great state of Ohio. But when I talk about climate change in Southeast Virginia, this image really doesn't resonate with anybody. Very few, at least in coastal Virginia by and large, are not growing corn in their backyard. And in reality, the issues that are important to people in Ohio are probably not particularly relevant for us in Southeast Virginia and vice versa, right? They're not really interested in sea level rise, for instance, in rural Ohio by and large. But a national report suggests that not only Virginia, but most of the US. I asked my students how many students have ever taken a course on the issue of climate change, and very few hands go up. And so you can imagine if you go back a generation or two, your parents or grandparents perhaps, it's without a doubt, you've probably had very little climate literacy communicated to you over the course of your life. So there's some headlines recently regarding the issue of climate change here in Southeast Virginia, and we think about military preparedness or extreme heat waves, the reimagined Chesapeake Bay in terms of the quality and the like of the Chesapeake Bay watershed, which is a really important geographic component to our region. I just want to kind of start with to set the foundation of what weather and climate is, because I think there's often a miscommunication of what we're talking about. So I just pulled some numbers here, and you can, in your own head, imagine what the average maximum temperature for today's date, November the 18th, is. It's pretty warm today. I think it was 74 I saw at one point, which is somewhat atypical for this time of year, right? On average, we're about 61, so we're about 13 degrees above average today. We've been colder, 36, excuse me, in 1929, and we've been a little bit warmer, 82 in 1938. But on average, we're 61, right? Be a little bit higher, a little bit lower, but on average, we're 61. And Dr. Marshall Shepard of the University of Georgia talks about weather is your mood and climate is your personality, right? A single day does not give you a great depiction of your personality, but over the long term, if you're always in a bad mood, that's probably a good indication that you have a bad mood personality, perhaps. But I think it's important to understand the difference between weather and climate, particularly as we think about long-term trajectory rather than day-to-day or seasonal variation. What we know around the world and in Virginia, here's a citation from a colleague, Dr. Jeremy Hoffman, who's the Science Museum of Virginia chief scientist. And this is looking at Virginia across the Commonwealth. We've warmed across every season, across every geographic domain. Some places are warming greater than others. And if you look at the globe, we know the Arctic is warming faster than the equatorial region for a variety of reasons I'm happy to get into later on. And we know that some seasons are warming, particularly the winter season, are warming much more significantly than other seasons. Most of the energy that we are seeing is going into the ocean, which is good and perhaps bad, particularly if we're along the coast. Communication matters. We know the warmest years on record have occurred in the last decade or 2 decades, I suppose. And this is just looking at that time series. You can see some may be an upward trend. If you go back a little further, right, the trend becomes a little bit more understandable. And if you look at the longer term trend, it becomes unmistakable. This is the hockey stick that Michael Mann has published about for decades. And this upward trajectory, particularly as we think about the relationship between heat trapping gases, is of concern. If we look at some public surveying data, so this is from Yale Climate Communication. I'm going to run through this rather quickly, particularly in the sense of time. But if we look at the US, this is county level data. You can see a geographic variability of where we have adults in the United States that, when surveyed, think global warming is happening. But when we ask them what are the main causes, human attribution, there's a disconnect. The scientific community, the experts, are well in agreement that humans are the primary cause of the warming of our planet, much like scientists are in agreement that the Earth is round and that smoking causes cancer, right? We still have the Flat Earth Society meeting every year in Denver. We still have people that believe smoking does not kill you, but the scientific evidence is pretty clear, and the consensus of that is very similar to this issue of climate change. And yet there's a disconnect with the public, and perhaps because of this great furry bear, the polar bear is often the face of climate change, for better or worse. We want to go cuddle with it. Coca-Cola's kind of popularized it in many ways, but in reality, we know the polar bear will tear your flesh off and kill you. And so the polar bear really isn't that, in the grand scheme of things, particularly important. But in reality, what is more relevant in terms of communicating the issue of climate change is the there and there, the us and we issue, right? Climate change isn't a there problem, meaning over there. It's not a there problem, meaning not me. It's a here and now. It's a me and you issue, whether we're thinking about Tangier Island and the migration that those individuals will face in our lifetime, whether we're thinking about the forced migration due to Syrian drought. We can think about wildfires this last summer, extreme heat in the Pacific Northwest, or the lack of air conditioning in parts of sub-Saharan Africa, right? These intersectional issues associated with the issue of climate change. So quickly, the evidence of climate change. We can look at dendrochronology records. You probably did this in 3rd or 4th grade, right? Look at the tree rings and count the tree rings, and you can see the seasonality of particular years, whether it's a drought or Jamestown, the colony of North Carolina. And you can kind of piece together what the environmental conditions were like looking at tree ring dendrochronology, kind of a cool couple 100-year paleoclimatology record. You can look at other evidences like ice cores or sediment cores in lake beds, and we can again put these pieces together and get a better understanding of what past climate has looked like. Some great research in Penn State and University of South Carolina look at these paleoclimate records, and even some faculty here at ODU do some of this type of lake bed sediment data. If you put all these pieces together, here's what we look at in terms of the past climate record. We know the climate has changed in the past. We know that it will climate change in the future, yes, but the question is the why of where, and what has led to this really upward trajectory in the last 150 years. And that's due to the Industrial Revolution and the burning of heat trapping gases like carbon dioxide, methane, and the like. I'm going to skip that slide just for sake of time. Often, as a climate scientist, we often get, well, Dr. Allen, do you know it's the sun is controlling the weather? And maybe you've heard this. And Dr. Marshall Shepard at the University of Georgia has some great TED Talks. I would encourage you to watch some of them if you're so interested. And he talks about an experience with a gentleman in an elevator, and he's a pilot. And he's telling the president of the American Meteorological Society that the sun is causing climate change. And Marshall just shakes his head and kind of itches his head and thinks, yeah, I went to school for 11 years. And I didn't learn that the natural variability of the climate system played a role. We understand these processes pretty well, actually. We understand that the Earth wobbles on its axis. We understand the orbital variations in terms of astronomy. We understand how to incorporate these factors. We understand that the sun, the sunspot cycles that is often cited runs on roughly 11-year cycles. But these changes that we see in the natural cycle cannot explain the observed changes that we are seeing in our planet. And that's because of the heat trapping gases phenomenon that I previously mentioned. The greenhouse effect is natural, yes. Without it, we would freeze to death. But we've enhanced this greenhouse effect as a result of our burning of heat trapping gases, whether it's transporting our food, driving our cars, flying around the world, et cetera. And consequently, the lowest layer of the atmosphere, which is called the troposphere, has been warming over the last century and a half. Some sources of these, again, this is one of the complexities of this, is how do we address this issue of climate change? It's not a transportation issue, it's not a food issue, it's a multitude of sectors. It's not just a carbon dioxide issue, it's also other heat trapping gases. It's also not just a their problem, being, we often hear, well, it's China, 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 or India, India, India. Yeah, China and India often are cited as burning more heat trapping gases. But if you look at their population, 1 in 4 people on Earth either live in China or India. And so the scale as a geographer really becomes important. On average, scientists suggest that if every person burned as many heat trapping gases as the average US American, we would need 5 Earths in terms of our consumption. of these heat trapping gases. And so it's not necessarily a us and them, but it's also a here and now issue. Over the last, this is from the IPCC, over the last century, there's no alternative explanation that we cannot explain this upward trajectory without accounting for the human factors that I've preceded to explain. So what's different? Really what's different is this rate of change. We've had as many carbon dioxide atoms in the atmosphere in the past, but we weren't here. Dinosaurs were roaming, and the equatorial region was near West Virginia, which is why we find coal in the certain locations, because of that peat moss that's decomposing over time. But this upward trajectory, the same rate of warming that we've experienced the last 150 years, is similar to the last glaciation period that took 10,000 years. So anybody do calculus, you can quickly do the rate of change and get the concern associated with this. This is a new concept. This guy with this really cool beard, going to defer to this topic again, running quickly. I tell my students, we're going to grow a beard like this, and they kind of look at me like I'm odd, right? But this gentleman 200 years ago was one of the first scientists to find the relationship between burning heat trapping gases and the warming of the planet. So this idea of greenhouse effect and anthropogenic climate change is not new, although some people on some individuals that I've highlighted on the right-hand side, and this is a great book. It's also a really good video if you're interested in watching it. The Merchants of Doubt have tried to continuously downplay the impacts of climate change, much like the tobacco industry of the 1940s, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, and early 90s suggested that smoking doesn't kill you. In reality, science knew that it killed you 70 years before federal policy in the US acknowledged that. All right, so that's kind of the evidence, the problem. And now I'm going to kind of go quickly through some examples of how Hampton Roads and Virginia are experiencing these impacts. And we can think about this across sectors, so human health, economic, national security, but also in terms of scale. Tangier Island, the peninsula, Williamsburg, the Commonwealth, planet Earth, okay? Climate change does not cause heat waves, but it certainly increases their probability, for example. So we have a shift in the means and extremes. Over the last 150 years, these heat waves have become more common, more frequent, more early occurring. As a consequence, this normal distribution has shifted to the right and also flattened out. Climate impacts health in a variety of different ways. The health community calls climate change a medical emergency because of deforestation leading to new vector-borne diseases, due to heavy rains disrupting food security operations, due to the migration of individuals fleeing yellow fever or Lyme disease, et cetera, and the like, or cardiovascular disease, asthma, respiratory functionality, infections, and the like. It's a health emergency, a public health crisis. And we can think about, we don't have to go that far away, that long ago in our past to look at these health impacts, right? The burning of the Pacific Northwest this last summer, that air eventually made it here to Virginia. And if you remember earlier this summer, even I think it was September, even I was teaching, we still had that hazy sky as a result of these wildfires, the wind blowing, and that particulate matter makes its way down in our bronchial tubes, not only blocking the sun, but also impacting our human health. Many people say it's only a degree, who cares? Your body temperature cares, because if your body temperature goes up 1 or 2 degrees, what happens? You're likely going to go to the hospital, right? And we're human systems, we're not other ecosystems that are much more vulnerable. So if you change the temperature of the ocean or the pH of the ocean, species either adapt, move, or die. Those are the 3 options that they have. We can see evidences on the eastern shore, middle peninsula, northern neck of ghost forests. Maybe some of you have seen these forests as a result of saltwater intrusion. There's a large effort in the Commonwealth looking at septic systems in terms of communities that rely on septic systems. But what happens to those septic systems as sea level rises? They become not very functional. And consequently, from a land use management perspective, forget the pollution of fecal material in your waterway, but in terms of the housing stock that exists and those individuals that need those septic systems, it's a significant concern in the current General Assembly moving forward. And this isn't a red issue. This isn't a blue issue, as many of my colleagues in the Southeast Virginia will attest. This is a human issue, right? Flooding doesn't look at your voter registration. And if your septic system is failing, it doesn't care who you voted for governor, right? This is a quote that I received from a student a couple years ago. I'm so ready for summer, but it's like we had no winter this year. And all my students love summer. I'm sure you love summer. I hate summer. I like being cold. Can't wait for tomorrow. Today was beautiful, but can't wait for tomorrow to put a little jacket on. But you know what else really likes summer? Mosquitoes. And so if you expand the summer season, that life cycle of the mosquito, for example, is consequently also lengthened. Some research from the Science Museum of Virginia, Dr. Jeremy Hoffman, as I mentioned earlier, looks at freeze dates in Richmond over the long term. And what you see is that freeze date is becoming, on average, later in the year. And this is similar research that I published in the International Journal of Climatology 3 or 4 years ago, looking at the changes of seasons across North America. And this trend is pretty common, right? We have a lengthening of the warm season, a delaying of these frost seasons. And so consequently, these ecological impacts are also potentially impactful. A quote from the National Climate Assessment talking about that exact concept of changing trends in nighttime temperatures may enhance or modify the frequency of flooding or drought, and other secondary effects such as pests and disease and production and infrastructure in terms of food security issues. This is also an interesting discourse regarding the Agalawa aquifer, in which you can see there on the right-hand side, we're taking feet or meters of this aquifer out every year for agricultural production. And a colleague of mine who works in West Texas cites that the amount of water we're taking out of these aquifers each year will take upwards of 200 to 300 years to recharge. Right? If you have $100 in the bank and every day you take $5 out, but you're only putting $1 back in, eventually what's going to happen to your piggy bank? You're going to be out of luck, right? So how do we address these issues? Climate change, the Department of Defense highlights climate change, and I'm happy to share these slides. If anybody wants them, I'm happy to have my contact information. I'll send you the PDFs. The Defense Secretary, Chuck Hagel, almost a decade ago now, it's called climate change a threat multiplier. This is particularly relevant for Hampton Roads, where you think about 40 cents or so of every dollar is tied to Hampton Roads federal defense spending, and what are the consequences of flooding. NASA Langley, Norfolk, Naval Station Norfolk, and others around the Southeast Tidewater region are working on this issue of climate change. They may not be calling it climate change, but they're certainly addressing the issue of flooding in terms of national security risk and to mitigate and prepare our military for military preparedness. And it's not just a military issue. Many of you probably have experienced flooding at one time or another. And yes, in Virginia, we're seeing more rainfall, more intense rainfall. And how does this interplay with things like sea level rise? In Hampton Roads, we are sinking, yes, but we are also experiencing relative sea level rise. So in the last 80 years, last generation or so, we've experienced 1.5 feet of sea level rise. The flooding on Larchmont Avenue or parts of our coastal communities, Seaford and the like, that flooding would not be nearly as extensive without that 1.5 feet of heavy rain, 1.5 feet of sea level rise, excuse me. And just to kind of visualize this, particularly as a geographer, this is from NOAA, part of NASA, part of the Department of Commerce. This looks at present day and then goes forward in trajectory. And you can actually zoom in and zoom out. And this isn't meant to say this is what your neighborhood will look like, but it's kind of a bathtub model that if you increase sea level by 1 foot, look at Poquoson. Look at the north part of Grandview here in Hampton, a great nature reserve, for instance. Look at the eastern shore, the Barrier Islands, for instance. Look at the south part of Virginia Beach. That's 1 foot. You can imagine, and this isn't accounting for a storm surge or heavy rain or hurricane, God forbid, right? We haven't had a major hurricane in almost 100 years. Irene was a Cat 1 when it made landfall. The last major hurricane was 1933. Knock on wood. Somewhere around here I have wood. That's 2 feet. Then we look at 3 feet, right? Jamestown is underwater in 3 feet. And again, this isn't accounting for storm surge or the like. And so how do we address this? Virginia Beach, this last November election, passed a referendum on a bond referendum to build critical infrastructure to address some of these flood concerns. That's just one way. It certainly raises equity issues in terms of other communities that maybe do not have the social capital or the economic capital to invest I think it was $1.2 billion or something of the sort. The scale of these issues is potentially significant. A colleague of mine, Dr. Tom Allen, did the same thing at a smaller scale using drone imagery. This is the Chrysler Museum in Norfolk, for those of you that are familiar. And he mapped the high tide line at the Hague here in present day. This is just high tide, not heavy rain, not a wind-driven flood event, not sunny day flooding, not right. And then he mapped what that high tide line looks at 2050, 2080, and by 2100, the Chrysler Museum every day is underwater. That's in a mortgage, right? If you think about a life, it's 2020 now, 2021, whatever it is, 2022 almost, I guess. The last 2 years have just flown by, I suppose. You know, your mortgage is now 2030 or 2050, excuse me, 30 years on 2021. So these time periods, we often think of some nefarious time in the future, but in reality, they're not that far away, right? I have friends that just had a baby boy, and that baby boy will likely see 2100. So what does this planet look like in 2100? I'll be dead probably, maybe not, who knows? These disasters are significantly costly, right? Hurricanes, heavy rain, wildfires, billions of dollars. So the economics of inaction are much more significant than the economics of actually doing something. And then lastly, here's this issue of Tangier. And it raises a really interesting question. 400 people on Tangier Island, a great, fascinating place, a cultural landscape like none other, an important historical landscape. And what precedent is there for, quote unquote, saving Tangier? What responsibility does the Commonwealth, does the federal government have? What responsibility do the individuals have in addressing this flooding sea level rise issue? I don't have answers, just more questions perhaps, but there's opportunities. I'm going to finish I have 6 minutes, Emma. I'm sorry. I talked very quickly. I had 67,000 slides and I deleted a couple as we were coming in. So there are opportunities to solve. This is one opportunity, right? This is one way we can solve this, is dig our head in the sand and say the sun is not going to rise. And we did this with smoking, right? Smoking doesn't kill you. For 50 years, we gave military personnel cigarettes in Korea and Vietnam and whatever else, despite the scientific evidence that smoking will kill you, right? This is also a solution, right? The earth is going to die and we're all SOL and there's no hope. Neither this nor this is particularly effective, right? And so what opportunities are there? This is an opportunity, and we see this here in coastal Virginia and Norfolk. If you drive Hampton Boulevard, for instance, you see houses raised in the last 3 or 4 years at a tune of $100,000 a pop via FEMA. That's one solution, although your car may still flood, the road still floods, right? So this is kind of a Band-Aid to a bleeding artery in some way. There's solutions top down and bottom up. Project Drawdown, there's a great TED talk, Chad Fleischner, I'm probably butchering that last name, highlights Project Drawdown, 100 climate solutions that we can have now. And they range from food issues in terms of food waste, right? A lot of food that's wasted decomposes, it releases heat trapping gases. And so one solution is to reduce food waste and to incentivize and think about food waste, right? If you go to the grocery store, what happens to those brown bananas tomorrow? They become trash. Is there a way to think about food waste? I love talking about food. I'll talk about food all night, but I have 3 minutes, so I'm not going to do that. We can think about top-down solutions in terms of Peru. The image on the left is from the Uluru Islands on Lake Titicaca. And the Uluru Islands, they're floating reed islands. Historically, they used kerosene fire to heat their food and to stay warm. And the government started seeing the kerosene on a floating reed island doesn't go well, right? Because what happens? The reeds catch on fire and then the island sinks and people are injured or killed, and that was what was happening. And so consequently, Peru, probably a decade or more now at this point, we went there in 2017, led a study abroad there. They invested and provided solar panels to all of the Uluru Islands. Now, if the poor people in Peru, and I have air quotes around that because I'm being facetious with that statement, if they can have solar panels on their house, what barriers are there to us here in Southeast Virginia having solar panels, right? And it's not a cost, because the poor people in Peru, air quotes around that again, have solar panels. It's not innovation. The solar panels have existed for decades. And Iceland, for example, has used geothermal energy for almost 150 years. So it's not some new nefarious thing. But there's also this economic aspect of subsidizing fossil fuels. And if we can think about how do we subsidize fossil fuels, and might there be a way to subsidize other forms of energy at the top down, but also the bottom up buy-in, that's one climate solution. A couple other climate solutions there highlighted on the right hand side. The headlines here are more local examples of incorporating climate change into the Chesapeake Bay Preservation Act, for instance, or rezoning the city of Norfolk to require developers to have new building standards to reduce flood risk. It's not addressing the cause of climate change in terms of heat trapping gases, but it is putting people out of harm's way with respect to flooding, heavy rain, storm surge, sea level rise, or the like. I love showing the map on the left, bottom left there. This is a couple years old now, I suppose, but and you drive over North Carolina and you start seeing solar farms. And you drive into parts of Maryland, Allison, and you see solar farms. And then you come back to the Commonwealth of Virginia, like, where are all the solar farms? Did the cloud come out? We don't get sun here in Virginia? What happened? Now, this is changing, particularly with wind in the last couple years, but there's still more work to do, particularly in the Commonwealth, in terms of the renewable energy standards that do exist. But this project drawdown on the right-hand side talks about, reducing plastic, incentivizing carpooling or public transit, or the bicycle option, which is always my personal favorite. Plant-rich diets. It takes 58 gallons of water to create a pound of beef. And again, I'm not here to say don't eat meat, but what are the consequences, what are the implications associated with that from a global perspective? So takeaway. 1 minute. All right. Takeaway. Climate change is real. Planet is warming rapidly. And I'm citing this, some of this is National Geographic. The click to add text is not supposed to be there. I apologize. The image on the right is Llewellyn Avenue in Norfolk. That's my bike route that individual is driving or spraying water on. Obviously, it's not a nice day to bike, so I just walked there. Humans are the primary cause, and the science is clear. Much like the earth is flat and smoking doesn't cause cancer. I'm sorry, scratch that. The earth is round and smoking does cause cancer. And that the potential impacts are potentially significant and catastrophic. If you look at 3, 4, 5 feet of sea level rise in coastal Virginia, that's a problem, right? But there are things to do, as I highlighted, not only to adapt to the consequences, whether it's raising your house, improving your building policy that was highlighted by the city of Norfolk, for instance, but we also have to mitigate the causes, and those causes are the heat trapping gases, reducing them at every scale and every sector immediately without any more political lollygagging. With that, I'm happy to have discussion, close my video, leave this great picture. This is not Norfolk or Hampton Roads. This is Idaho, I believe. And there's my contact information via email and or Twitter, or we can chat offline. Emma, back to you, I suppose. Or if there's questions, I don't know how you want to do it. You're in charge. You do you.
Thank you so much. That was so informative and a lot of information. I'm sure there are questions. So if anyone wants to unmute, if that's okay with you, Dr. Allen, unmute or type into the chat.
I see like 12 faces, so.
give an opportunity for that. So, shot.
Don't be shy. Somebody has to have a question. Tom, you're on mute. I only see you're the only face I see.
Oh.
Yeah, you're still on mute. There you are.
Okay, Dr. Allen. Now, a big problem with climate deniers, because as long as there are a lot, we'll be slow in addressing the problem. In talking up global warming, it's you could hit deniers with the fact that the models say that the stratosphere should cool if you put the trace gases out, and in fact, it's much more pronounced than the than the surface warming. It doesn't seem to be this record, consistency of the models and the observations, which is much, much more dramatic in the stratosphere. It doesn't seem to be used in presentations to the public as much.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
It's an arrow that can be fired, I think.
It's complex, and that's a great point, Tom. And I really spend time in my classes to talk about the different layers of the atmosphere, because most people don't know there are different layers of the atmosphere. That temperature decreases with height up until a certain point, and then it actually increases, and then it decreases back as you go up into the ionosphere, for instance. But your point of the stratosphere cooling, yeah, that's a great, very scientific kind of niche. I think one of the challenges of communicating that, though, is we think of the atmosphere as uniform. And so I'm really specific that the troposphere is warming, but you are right, the stratosphere is cooling. And as a result of those differential outcomes, that's another example of that it's the human factor, because if the whole atmosphere was cooling, much like the stratosphere was, that would be an indication that it's natural, that we are not, but the atmosphere is warming differentially across the vertical transect. And it's much like we know the different sources of these greenhouse gases because of the different isotope numbers that are associated with natural sources of carbon dioxide versus fossil fuel burnt. But some of that's nuance. It gets, from a general public standpoint, it kind of just goes over their head. But scientific literacy, to your point, Tom, is certainly needed, and that's why I love giving these talks, and always happy to answer such questions as you pose.
I think, Dr. Allen, there's a question in the chat from
sorry.
Christine. I don't know if you can see that down there.
Yeah, okay. I think we need address restricting. Yeah, Upton St. Clair says you can't convince somebody of a fact if their paycheck depends on it. From the jungle. Now, some people would say, well, Dr. Allen, you're in it for the grant money, right? Marshall Shepard has a great TED talk about climate zombies. And if I was in it for the money, which you can look at my salary, I'm not in it for the money, trust me. I'm an educator, not a fossil fuel executive. I would be saying we actually need more research to investigate the problem, and we need to understand the issue more. In reality, climate scientists say, no, we know the problem. We need to actually do something about it. So that never makes sense to me at all. I think I answered your question a little bit, Christine. And the subsidies to fossil fuels certainly are a challenge. I think this kind of gets at Tom's a little bit, his comment as well. There's enough support across the aisle, dare I say, uniformly to address flooding. People, I don't care what you call it, whatever. People in Virginia Beach are getting wet. And so how do we address that? Now we can build infrastructure like Virginia Beach is going to do, but in reality, that's not going to address the causes. These flood events are going to continue to propagate without addressing the causes, and those causes are heat trapping gases. But there's certainly a movement, slowly, yes, not nearly to the speed at which it needs to take place, but there is movement in terms of transferring the energy sector, modifying, hybrid cars, solar panels, food waste, all of these other opportunities. But some of those are top down, and there's also a lot of climate solutions that are bottom up. Light bulbs, forget light bulbs, that's not doing anything. But food waste, these other aspects that are highlighted by that Project Drawdown documentary or TED Talk, excuse me, are really educating people. Dr. Catherine Hayhoe at Texas A&M, Texas Tech, I get them mixed up all the time, I apologize. She talked about the best thing you can do about climate change is just talk about it, because nobody talks about it. Except me, I love talking about it. On the bus, in the coffee shop, at the restaurant, at the beach, wherever.
I see it said Steven's iPad is unmuted. Did you have a question, Steven? Man, I have a question, Dr. Allen.
Please call me Mike. That's formal.
So just as someone who's not wrapped up in the world of climatology or geography, what's like I could change like one really important thing about my day-to-day actions, my day-to-day activities. Do you have, I mean, I know this is probably like, there is no one solution, right? But like, is there something that, I'm sure you've thought about it, that you'd recommend to people? Like if you could just do one thing that you could change right now forever about your day-to-day life that would help on the larger scale. Do you have any thoughts to that?
Christine said, stop eating meat. That would probably be my second, although certainly, I think I already said that the first one, that's just talk about it. I think making this a human issue, forget the polar bear, not that it's not cute and cuddly, but I'm not going to go cuddle a polar bear. It's going to tear my flesh off and kill me. We have to make this a table issue, a food issue, a transportation issue, a safety issue, a national security issue, an insurance cost issue, right? Think about flood insurance and what the implications of a changing NFIP will mean for the general public in terms of flood insurance. And that's a really important for coastal Virginia. And there's a balance here, right? How do you ensure the communities are resilient to flooding, but also recognize that maybe we shouldn't be building in high risk flood zones. This is something I get frustrated, for lack of a term, in the city of Norfolk. We are building, if you're familiar with Norfolk, there's a part of Norfolk called Lake Olney. It's behind the Chrysler Museum. It's Olney, and I forget the cross street there. And it floods all the time with heavy rain or sunny day flooding, because it was an old creek bed that we filled in, fine. But we're actually now, the developer is now building a condo there. And I'm just, it's putting risk at the forefront. So there's no silver bullet, Emma, to your point, but I think there's things that we each can do. And that one big thing is, I think, talking about it explicitly. And then to Christine's comment in the chat, maybe not giving up meat. I recognize some people are never going to give up meat, but certainly eating less meat or eating more local. I think that's the other challenge. Maybe not even eating no meat, but also the local aspect of this, right? Because our food comes from thousands of miles away. It's transported via train, rail, and car to your food line or wherever you shop. And then you waste half of it. But instead, if you build a relationship with a farmer or a farmer's market, for instance, right, you're providing economic vitality for that individual, but you're also building your local economic. You're also supporting a way of life for them, and also reducing your heat trapping gases via transportation of your food. And I went on a long tangent there, so I apologize again.
That was awesome. That was great. We've got another question in the chat.
Comment. There are a set of inevitable effects of climate change or sea level rise. Oops, sorry. There's a set of inevitable effects of climate change, sea level rise, given cryptic conditions, positive feedback loops, and how should the Hampton Roads public plan accordingly? Yeah. The science is pretty clear, right? Without reducing these heat trapping gases, Larry Atkinson, rest in peace, ODU, said a couple years ago on PBS, he said there's nothing to stop sea level rise, right? If we continue to melt the Arctic, and we continue to, it's basic physics. So we are, without significant action, we are looking at potentially catastrophic sea level rise, which is particularly, not only it's not think about scale, right? Tangier Island, 400 people, they're going to be forced to migrate and move because of not sea level rise, but because of mostly probably the septic issue that I mentioned earlier. But then you scale that to Hampton Roads. Okay, 1.7 million people plus or minus, whatever. But then you scale that and compare it to like Miami, right? We are the Tangier Island of Miami in this larger context, or San Francisco, or Long Beach, right? The port of Long Beach is much more quote unquote significant than the port of Norfolk, port of Virginia, excuse me. Or Bangladesh, right? The whole country. This issue of scale becomes increasingly. So should we plan? Yeah, we should reduce heat trapping gases immediately. We should incentivize mobility options. We should all of these things. We should not be building in high risk flood zones, but reducing heat trapping gases, I think, is the important thing there. Yeah, Smith Island's a great example, Christine, of what can be. Yeah, some good stuff in the chat here of farmers market. I'm not familiar with. I mean, I'm familiar with Williamsburg because I love biking up there on the Capitol Trail, but I'm not familiar with kind of the intricacies of CSAs. CSAs are a great option too. Community-sponsored agriculture, where you can kind of pay the farmer or the producer early upfront, and that gives them some capital to then invest, and then they give you a box of fruit and vegetables at random occasionally in the springtime or summer or whatever you choose. Tom, you're gonna. Yeah, Tom, go ahead. You're on mute again. Now you're on mute again.
Yeah. Okay. I very much agree with you, Professor Allen, that it's really important, as Emma asked, talking about the problem is very important, but it depends on where you are in the population. Now, if you're one who is one of the 1%, and you love to have these outstanding cultural experiences by flying around in jet planes, that's about the worst thing you could do tomorrow for the climate is to get into a jet plane. And it's something we all love to do. Yep. Just before COVID hit us, that component of transportation was going up internationally by 8 to 10% a year for decades, and it's going to come back. So one thing that you can do is to greatly reduce your long distance travel. Flying from here to San Francisco, you put about the same amount of CO2 in the atmosphere as if you drove from here to San Francisco. So very long trips by airplane or by fossil fuel, other means of fossil fuel, really damn the climate. Mass transit is better than individual transit. And
which is non-existent in Hampton Roads, right?
Yeah. Yeah, you can't even get across the water. Yeah. But talking about it is political advocacy. We sorely need accelerated technological development so that the means of generating energy become cheaper if they're renewable rather than if they're fossil fuel. And that's going on, but it could be going on faster.
Yeah, I think that it raises, there's a couple comments there. I think the last point raises this top-down, bottom-up perspective, right? The reasons fossil fuels are cheaper, quote unquote, yeah, cheaper, although that's suspect at best as well, is because of the subsidies that exist. You know, to the earlier comment in the chat, I suppose if we got rid of the subsidies and or the individuals that were bankrolled by the fossil fuel industry and incentivized green or investment, if you go to Amsterdam to talk about the flying, that was my last trip before the world went to crap. And Amsterdam, I was on a walking tour, and the tour guide said, in Amsterdam in the Netherlands, you have people, you have bikes, you have the train or the bus, you have whatever else, and then you have cars. Because they have the infrastructure. If you go to Google Maps and hit the bike, their infrastructure in the Netherlands is dumbfounding at the ability to bike from the international airport to almost anywhere you want to go in Amsterdam on a safe, dedicated bike lane. And consequently, the gas is really expensive. Iceland, right? The gas there to fill up my little Kia for 2 days touring there a couple of years ago, it was $90 to fill up my gas tank. That sticker shock makes you, well, but it's because of the incentives that they do not have in terms of the fossil fuels and recognizing the investment in public transit. And most of the people in Iceland, for example, live in Reykjavik. Yes, if we paid the true cost of gasoline, we'd be like Amsterdam too. I asked my students, do you really think milk is $2.15 a gallon? Like, to grow the cow, to milk the cow, to transport the milk, to cool the milk, to pay the clerk, to do you really think that's I mean, maybe. Do you think gas is $3.25? I'm not saying there's obstacles to that. And particularly from a communication perspective, that's a challenge. So I'm not downplaying that, particularly at the pocketbook situation we find ourselves in. But the reality is a lot of that is in some way a fallacy because of the fossil fuel existence that we have. When you address population growth at global level, we're talking about 8 million people per year. Population growth never mentioned. Yeah, it's interesting. So 2 comments to that. There's an environmental equation. It's called IPAT. The impact on the environment is population, affluence, and technology. And many people say as you grow population, you have more of an impact on the environment. That's not actually accurate, because if you look at the per capita, right, per capita, to Tom's point, maybe per capita CO2 emissions in the United States pales in comparison to the many other developing countries. The water usage or gasoline usage in New York City is far less than most other places in North America, because you don't have a car. If you live in New York City, it's all the people coming into New York City, driving into the city. It's not the people. It's too expensive to have a car in New York City or Manhattan, right? The insurance, the parking, the gas, the fuel, all that stuff. And you don't need it because you have the transportation. So certainly, and the second point I'll make to that is that the population, China, many people harp on the China two-child policy of the last generation. What does China's population look like without that two-child policy? I'm not saying it's good, bad, left, right, up, down, but I am here to make you think, and what's the implications of a generation of my ilk that we're restricted to having. I'm not saying we should have that, but there are certainly implications of, the 1.5 billion people in China. In the United States, we have this American exceptionalism complex. We think the world revolves around us. We are very, very small in terms of total population of the world. 5 times people live in China and 4 times in India. One in 4 people in the world live in one of those 2 countries. Scale becomes an issue. I don't know if I answered that question. Was that John or Joe? Joan, excuse me, I apologize. I teach a medical geography. Sorry, Emma, I'll finish with this. I teach a medical geography class occasionally, and one of our questions, I see the term eugenics in there, and one of our discussions is on the issue of eugenics. I don't have answers, but it's certainly a thought-provoking question of quality of life versus length of life. Don't have answers, just interesting thought provoke. Anyways, my email is mallen@odu. I'm also on Twitter and things. If you're interested, you feel free to shoot me an email. Always happy to chat, like I said, via coffee or beer or Zoom. This is tea, so don't.
I was gonna say, if you really liked this chat today, you might even email him in a couple months and say, "Hey, will you come to my local library's event?" He'll probably say
Not
yes.
that anybody would do that, Emma, but
only weird people do that. But I did want to also share in the chat real quick before everyone signs off. If you're interested in other great talks and speakers, the Clean County Commission through James City County recently put out a series that I actually put together called the Stewardship Hour. And for the last year, every month or every other month, they've put up a video. So this is a link to their YouTube channel. The videos have sort of been edited together. There's typically like a topic of the night, and a speaker who comes to speak on something. And then the typical structure is that there's 5 actions that you can actively take, either as an individual, as a community, a way to educate others, and then a way to boost the local economy around that issue. So if you're interested in getting more involved on any level, the Stewardship Hour, especially if you live in James City County, is a good jumping off point. It's pretty amateur because it's just me, but but we got some good people on there, and there's some really good information. So thanks everybody for coming.
Thanks for Emma for organizing. I'm really impressed with the turnout. So thank you all for coming out on a Thursday, beautiful Thursday night. Yeah.